Biases are extremely difficult to combat. And part of the problem is you may not even realize you have the bias. In fact, there's a bias called the bias blind spot where you're sure you don't have any biases, but you are damn sure everybody else has biases. And part of the reason it's hard to spot them is because 95% of cognition is happening below the conscious level, right? So the vast majority of your decisions are happening before you even realize you've made them. So the next time somebody asks you why you did something, the most honest answer you can give is, how the hell should I know? Even when you do know about the bias, even when you're aware, you do it anyway. So there's a bias called anchoring. And the way it works is you might have, I might ask everyone on this call to write down the last couple numbers of their social security number. And I might then say, okay, let's all bid on a bottle of wine. And if you wrote down a low number, you will bid lower for that bottle of wine. If you wrote down a high number, you will bid higher for that bottle of wine. It's anchoring, it's a thing. Now, I could tell you all of that before we did the experiment, and you would still do the thing. In fact, I could say, I will pay you cash money not to bid based on your social security number, and you would still do it. Now, the reason we need to care about this as content strategists or designers or just people who make things is an idea called choice architecture. And the easiest way to understand choice architecture is to think about going to the grocery store and getting some produce. Most people know you don't pick from the top of the pack because the grocer is going to put the product that they're trying to move, the oldest product, at the top where it's easy to reach. They have architected that experience to favor themselves. They could just as easily architect it to favor the person going to the grocery store by putting the freshest produce in the easiest place to reach. But the point is you can architect experiences in a way that affects people's decision-making. So I want you to think about the decisions your user needs to make, and then think about how people make decisions. And not necessarily the way rational people make decisions, because we just saw 95% of the time your user is making decisions they're not even aware of. There are, in fact, content and design choices we can make that help keep harmful cognitive biases in check, or even use them for good. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. As it turns out, if you have two identical resumes, and the only difference is the name at the top, if it is a male-dominated field, the name that reads as male will move up the chain, and the name that reads as female will stay on the pile. But here's the point. Why do you actually need that information? As a hiring manager, how is it helping you to know that person's name? Think of it like a signal-to-noise problem. The signal, the thing you're really looking for, are the qualifications, the experience. The noise is really the gender or the race or whatever you're reading into the name in terms of gender and race. When the city of Philadelphia tried out a round of anonymized hiring for a web developer position, they learned two things pretty quickly. One, if you want to anonymize a resume, even in the high-tech world of web development, you have to have an intern who has no stake in the hiring process physically print it out and get a marker and like redact it like a CAA document. The other thing they realized is that when they found a resume they liked, they would go to GitHub, which is a code repository, and really where a developer would keep their portfolio of sorts. And as soon as they get to the GitHub profile of that person, all of the personal information would show up, the picture, the name, and it would ruin the experiment. So clever people that they are, they created a Chrome plugin that as that page loaded would anonymize all of the personal information. And then just to complete the circle, they put that code back on GitHub. It's there right now if you ever want to use it for a round of anonymized hiring. Now, this isn't just about getting people to make better hiring decisions. This is also about robots. So Amazon had a hiring bot they created to help make decisions about hiring. And they found that it was extremely sexist. It was so sexist that it would, even if it saw the name of a woman's college on a resume, it would downgrade the resume. And they tried to figure out, how did this robot get so sexist? Well, they looked at the training data. What did they use to train the AI? And it was like the last 10 years or so of resumes. Guess what all those resumes had in common? Most of them were from men. So the AI took one look at that, said, you sure must like dudes, and just kept recommending guys. I am of the opinion that we should be lying to AI. We think what we need to do when we train AI is pointed at the world we've got so it can make good predictions about the future. The problem with that theory is the world we've got is very sexist and very racist. So if you train it on that, it will make very racist and very sexist predictions. This can go in the other direction though. So Amazon Go is a store where you walk in, take what you want, and you leave. And there's no cashiers because Amazon is automatically deducting everything you took from your account. Now, Ashley Clark Thompson wrote an article for CNET called "In Amazon Go, No One Thinks I'm Stealing," because she had a very peculiar experience in these stores. There is a phenomenon known as shopping while black, and what it looks like is very aggressive customer service. Hi, can I help you? No, really, can I help you? No, really, can I help you? Ashley Clark Thompson had experienced none of that because there was no cashier there to make her experience that. So by removing one design element, namely the cashier, they created a less biased experience. And we're even seeing this play out in the judicial system. San Francisco is trying out blind charging. So typically the district attorney has tons of leeway in whether or not they choose to prosecute a crime. And typically, they would tend to prosecute persons of color more frequently than their white counterparts. So they said, well, why do we need to know the race of the offender? Why do we need to even know the race of the victim? In fact, why do we even need to know where the crime occurred? Let's just get what happened, right? So this is an experiment they're playing with now to see if it will result in less biased charging. Another concept I want to make sure we get into is called cognitive fluency. And basically the way it works is if something looks like it's going to be easy to read, I will assume whatever it is talking about is also going to be easy to do. By the same token, if something looks like it's going to be hard to read, I will assume whatever it's talking about is going to be hard to do. Now, I love to make pancakes. I have been making a lot of them lately. And this is a recipe for pancakes. And the text is kind of clumped together and it's kind of small. And if I glance at that, before I read a word, I might conclude, you know what? I bet pancakes are hard to make. I don't think I'm going to make pancakes. Now, if I see a recipe with big photography and small bursts of text, I might think, you know what? I bet pancakes aren't that hard to make. A 2-minute video, forget about it. We're having pancakes. Now, if we take this to something like public transportation, right? I'm trying to get from Media, PA to downtown Philadelphia. And if I look at that train schedule, I will take one glance at that. And before I read a word, I will assume that public transportation is impossible to use. If I look at that app, even before I read any of the text, I'm immediately thinking to myself, I bet public transportation isn't that hard. Now, if we were all in a room together, I would have you raise your hands. I will let you vote privately. But which of the following is true? Rosa Parks was born in 1912? Or Rosa Parks was born in 1914. Make your vote. Your gut reaction, if you behave like most people this experiment has been done with, is to vote for 1914. And the reason is, if something is easier to read, we tend to think it's more true. But it gets worse. If something rhymes, we actually think it's more true. And this has consequences. So what's happening here is that we like things that are easy to process because we love certainty. One thing I've seen looking at bias after bias after bias is they're all shortcuts to certainty. We hate uncertainty and we love certainty so much that we will throw logic under the bus, we will throw other people under the bus to get to certainty. And things that are easy to process feel more certain. It's like memory. If I ask you what you got for your 5th birthday, you might not remember that well. If I said, oh, you got a truck, right? You really might not feel certain about that answer. You might not feel that it's true. On the other hand, if I ask you what you had for breakfast this morning, you can probably recall that pretty easily and be pretty confident in your answer. We equate things that are easy to process, easy to remember, with things that are more true. Things that rhyme are easier to remember, easier to process. Things that are easy to read are easier to process, and so they feel more true. Now, this becomes important when we think about things people need to believe. In this country, there is a crisis where African Americans generally do not trust health information that comes from the government. 2002, 2003, when responding to the statement, the government usually tells the truth about major health issues like HIV/AIDS. Only 37% of African-American respondents said yes. By 2016, that had dropped to 18%. And you can imagine in the time of COVID, right? It is really important that things that are actually true need to be believable. Now, we could do a whole other talk about why there are legit reasons African Americans have concerns about health information coming from the government. But the fact of the matter is this is information that could save lives. So if it needs to rhyme, if it needs to use very plain language, so be it. Now, my editor very wisely, when I was putting this into the book, asked me, well, can you actually back that up? Can you point to health outcomes that are better because of plain language or things being easy to read? And I said, thank you for challenging me with that, because now I actually have to see if this is real. And I found out, yes, it is. Pregnant smokers and ex-smokers who received a specially designed intervention with materials written at the 3rd grade reading level were more likely to achieve abstinence during pregnancy and 6 weeks postpartum than those who received standard materials. So women who were smoking during pregnancy but received easy to process, easy to read materials were more likely to stop and then not even start again after they had their children. Also, a plain language pictogram-based intervention used as part of medication counseling resulted in decreased medication dosing errors and improved adherence among multi-ethnic, low socioeconomic status caregivers whose children were treated at an urban pediatric emergency department. So caregivers, right, when they were given easy to process information, resulted in better care being given. Now you might say, Dave, that's all good and well, I get it, plain language, but rhyming, really? Can rhyming make a difference? Turns out it can. So the Click It or Ticket campaign was rolled out a while back, and it was basically legislation that was passed that meant you could get a ticket if you didn't wear your seatbelt. And there was a legislative aspect to it, which was pretty effective, mostly for older folks, but younger folks weren't really catching on as quickly. So they rolled out Click It or Ticket as part of a media campaign. And what they found was that national belt use among young men and women ages 16 to 24 moved from 65% to 72% and 73% to 80% respectively. And just to put those numbers in perspective, for each percentage point you increase in seatbelt use, 270 lives are saved. So that's something like 4,000 lives saved through rhyming. It's silly, but it works. And this is actually a part of federal law. So there is a Federal Plain Language Act of 2010, which basically said that if you are a federally funded, government website giving out some kind of service, you better be talking about that service using plain language. And if you're looking for the definition of plain language in that sense, 18F has some fantastic plain language guidelines I highly encourage you to check out. That easy to process thing even extends to name pronunciation. So there is a name pronunciation effect where if a name is easier to pronounce, that person will do better. And easy to pronounce is culturally sensitive. So some cultures, Smith is easier to pronounce, other cultures, Mbimu is easier to pronounce. But if your name is easier to pronounce in that culture, it can help with voting preferences. It can help with getting a job. My favorite example is they looked at law firms, and the higher you went up the chain in the law firm, the easier the names got to pronounce. This even extends to stocks. So if you have an IPO and the name of your company is easier to pronounce, it will perform better than a stock whose name is harder to pronounce. It even extends to that little ticker like abbreviation. If the abbreviation is easier to pronounce, it will perform better than something that is difficult to pronounce. So we lay down real cash money on things that are easy to process. I think that the most dangerous bias in the world is the framing effect. So it starts out pretty innocent. So let's say you go to a store and you see a sign that says beef 95% lean. And then next to that, there's a sign that says beef 5% fat. Which one do you think people are going to buy? It's the same thing, but I have framed it so that one seems more favorable than the other. And this is all good and well when we're talking about beef. But what if I were to say, should we go to war in April or should we go to war in May? See what I did there? We're no longer discussing whether or not it's a good idea to go to war in the first place. And wars have been started over less. Now, if you are multilingual, even bilingual, you have an advantage, a weapon against the framing effect. If you think about the decision in your non-native language, you are less likely to fall for the scam. So if I were to think about the beef decision in French, I speak a little bit of French. It would go something like this. Beef, that's bœuf, that's a lot of vowels, 95%, I think that's 89, maybe, right? And by the time I've gotten through all of that, the deception is obvious to me. And it's because I've slowed down my thinking. The seminal work on cognitive bias is called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And in it, he basically purports that when we are thinking quickly, that's what bias is. That's where bias lives, right? Is thinking too fast and making mistakes. When we slow down our thinking and really process things, that's when we make better decisions. And unfortunately, we don't have so much energy to do that all the time every day. We only have a set number of things we can use that with. So be very careful where you decide to apply your slow thinking. Now, the framing effect can be used for good. So there's another experiment where you show an audience this photo and say, should this person drive this car? And what ensues is a policy discussion. And some people will say, old people are bad at everything. Don't let them drive. And you'll have other people saying, that's ageist. What are you talking about? People should do what they want. And all you'll learn by the end of that conversation is who's on what side. Now, you can show the exact same photo to another audience and ask, how might this person drive this car? And what you will get is a design discussion. And some people will say, well, what if we change the shape of the steering wheel? What if we move the dashboard? And what you'll learn by the end of that conversation is several ways that person might be able to drive that car. Now, all I did was change 2 words, but I've framed the conversation differently and gotten an entirely different conversation. In fact, what if I were to say, how might we do a better job of moving people around? Because that's the reason the guy was in the car in the first place. He was there, but he wanted to be over there. Now, if I frame it this way, things like public transportation are on the table. And we can see this play out in situations like teacher evaluations. So University of Iowa noted that teachers, when they're being evaluated by their students, if they are women or people of color, they tend to be judged more harshly than their white male counterparts. And so they added a little bit of language at the beginning of the surveys they sent out for one group of the population that basically said this. It said, look, female teachers, teachers of color generally are treated unfairly on these things. So when you're making your evaluation, make sure that you're evaluating based on real things and not just appearance. And the people who got those paragraphs before they filled out the survey tended to rate women and people of color better than the people who didn't. I'd like to close by talking about our own cognitive biases, because these are the ones that can really get our users in trouble. One of them is notational bias. And a good way to think about notational bias is I played saxophone when I was a kid, and I had to learn how to read music like this, Western style notation, sheet music. And I used to think that, well, this is it. Like any music in the world can be expressed through this, right? I was wrong, very wrong. There are tons of African and Asian music that you simply can't, this is inadequate, it doesn't work. And if we make this the default, you're erasing tons of cultures. We see this more commonly when we're creating forms that ask for personal information. If I have in my head that, well, there's 2 genders, right? Male and female. Then I bake that into my form. I am now eradicating God knows how many different identities. While we're on the topic of asking for personal information, it's really important that you know about something called the self-serving bias. So the self-serving bias is pretty straightforward. If something goes well, that's my fault. If something goes poorly, that's your fault. Usually this plays out that way with computer interactions. We treat computers like people. So if I'm doing something online and something goes wrong, it's the computer's fault. And if something goes right, it's my fault. Unless I've given that computer personal information. The more personal information you give a computer, the more likely you are to blame yourself if something goes wrong. And think about it. Who do you give personal information to? Your friends. You're treating the computer like a personal friend. So be very thoughtful and selective about when and how and why and what you're asking when you decide to ask for personal information, because it is possible that the more you do it, you are engendering a potentially unhealthy relationship between your user and technology. This one always breaks my heart. Until 1986, the New York Times prohibited the use of Ms. as an honorific for women. And the way that would work is at the first mention of a woman's name in an article, you would use her full name, and that at every subsequent mention, you would say Miss last name or Mrs. last name. And the pattern this sets up, and remember how important patterns are, the pattern this sets up is that the most important thing to know about a woman is whether or not she is married. And remember, there's no such requirement for men because Mr. doesn't tell you anything. Now think about that in article after article after article for literally 100 years. The pattern that sets up and the assumptions it now sets up in your brain. So we need to be very careful of the structured content we create and the content guidelines that we create, because if we create them in an imbalanced way, you can easily scale a very bad pattern. As Mbimu Kugomu put it, language doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it. And I'll give you an example, like where this is legally true. So Dick Cheney, Vice President Cheney, back in the day, decides he's got stuff that he wants to get done, and he wants to know how much legal leeway he has. So his lawyers tell him, well, you are the vice president, therefore, obviously, you are in the executive branch. But you cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, so that means you're also in the legislative branch, but you can't be in both the executive branch and the legislative branch. So maybe you're in neither. And if you're in neither, maybe you don't have to follow the rules of either. And he didn't. We see the same thing play out today with platforms. So Facebook, when it suits them, will say, well, we are a publisher. New York Times, come publish with us. We know you. But if someone points out, well, there are rules for publishers, they can say, oh, I don't know what you heard. We're a platform. Yeah, we don't do that. There are tools out there to help us with some of this language. So Radical Copy Editor is a very good resource for finding out how to write about folks who usually don't get a lot of say in how they're written about. Textio is another good tool. And by the way, I'll be sending out a resource sheet later with links to all of this and more. So don't feel like you have to like scribble it all down. But Textio is a really good resource for thinking about inclusive language. It's particularly good with resume writing job descriptions, because not everybody wants to be a rock star or a ninja. There is a concept that exists in other language that I wish we had in English. It's called evidentiality. And the way it works is in English, we use our verb tenses we're pretty basic about how we use our verb tenses. It just tells you when something happened. Bob went to the store. Bob is going to the store. Bob will go to the store. Other languages like Turkish are actually make their verb tenses do a little more heavy lifting. So in those languages, the verb tense kind of tells you how I know Bob went to the store, right? So there's one verb tense for I personally saw Bob go to the store. There's another verb tense for somebody told me Bob went to the store. And there's a whole other verb tense for like, I read on the internet that Bob went to the store. But the point is, I can't tell you that Bob went to the store without also telling you how I know Bob went to the store. Now think about behavior. Think about how much more thought you'd put into what you decide to post or share based on being on the hook for how you know what you just said, right? And, you know, I can imagine there might be a need for this kind of proof in the world we live in today, just maybe. But English does not have this. So maybe there are ways we can play with design and content to introduce it. So for example, remember how I was saying that if something's easier to read, it is easier to believe? The reverse is true. If something's harder to read, it is in fact harder to believe. So this is an actual article from back in the day when they first dropped I think it was the new trailer for the new James Bond film. And the first paragraph is pretty much confirmable facts, right? This is the name of the movie. This is who's starring in it. The second paragraph is about a rumor about why the first director was fired. The first paragraph is pretty easy to read. It's pretty easy to believe, and it should be. It's got confirmable facts. The second paragraph is pretty hard to read. It's pretty hard to believe, and it should be. It's a rumor. So I encourage all of us to start thinking more creatively about how we can represent evidentiality in a language that doesn't inherently have it. I told you we'd come back to this one. So let me tell you about how I completely misinterpreted the scientific method. I used to think that the scientific method was basically, I have an idea about how the world works, and then I test my theory, and then you try the same thing I did, and you try the same thing I did, and you try the same thing I did, and if we all get a positive result, yay, that's a law, let's move on. After talking to some real scientists, I found out it's a little different. The way it really works is more like this. I have an idea about how the world works, and I try some stuff out to see if I'm right. And then if I like what I come up with, you try the same thing I did, and you try the same thing, and you try the same thing. And if we all get the same results, great. I get to spend the rest of forever trying to prove myself wrong. I have to ask myself, if I'm wrong, what else would be true? And then I have to go and try to prove that. That is a much more rigorous process, and that is much more what the scientific method is like. And it was invented to fight confirmation bias. Now, as people who make things, it is very easy for us to leave good content strategy or good design on the table. Let me show you how easy. Let's say we're going to play a game, and the computer is going to ask us, hey, put whatever number you want where that question mark is, and hit enter, and I will tell you whether or not that number fits the pattern. Put in as many numbers as you like, and when you're ready, tell me what you think the pattern is. If you're like me, you say, I am going to try this. And the computer says, congratulations, that fits the pattern. Would you like to try another number? And if you're like me, you say, nah, I got this, hold my beer. The pattern is even numbers. And the computer says, no, it's not. And the reason the computer says that is because I never tried this. The pattern is not even numbers. The pattern is every number is higher than the number that came before it, which is a much more elegant solution, much more easy to code, probably cheaper, right? But I never got there because I was so in love with my even numbers idea. Now, there are tools out there to help us as designers and makers of things to avoid that pitfall. And one of them is called red team, blue team. And this is a method that both the military and journalists use. And let's just pause to appreciate how rare that is. But the basic idea is you have a blue team who kind of carries the idea through research and sort of wireframing and maybe even almost at a prototype stage. But before they go that far, the red team comes in for one day. And the red team's job is to go to war with the blue team and to find all those hidden biases, right? All those potential harms that the blue team didn't see because they were so in love with their initial idea. Now, what I like about this approach is that it's cost effective. I don't have to say to my COO, oh yeah, guess what? From now on, we have to spin up 2 teams for every project and they're gonna check each other's work every day. No, I just need one team for one day to make it a little less likely that we're gonna put something harmful out into the world. Another tool I like for this is called speculative design. And it's a lot like Black Mirror, if you've ever watched that show. Black Mirror is a twilight zone for tech. You take some near future tech and you see what would happen if you gave it to real people. And of course, it's terrible. But it's basically imagining this unhappy path for your tech. And I feel that by law, anybody working on a new technology should be forced to write a Black Mirror episode about that technology. But this is a real job. Superflex went to the United Arab Emirates to help them figure out the future of energy, right? So the UAE is trying to decide, do we continue down the road of fossil fuels or do we start investigating alternative energy? And one of the things Superflex did was to say, okay, let's imagine what your air quality will be like 10 years out, 20 years out, if you stay on the path of fossil fuels. But they didn't just figure it out, they bottled it. And then they made them breathe it. And within about 10 years, it becomes unbreathable. Now, causation or correlation, but at the end of that engagement, the UAE announced that they were going to invest about $150 billion with a B dollars in renewables. The last bias I want to talk about is called the déformation professionnelle. Told you I spoke French. Now, déformation professionnelle is basically the idea that you see the whole world through the lens of your job. And in the workaholic society we live in, that may seem like a good thing until it's not. The paparazzi who ran Princess Di off the road that night probably thought they were doing a good job. And technically speaking, they were. They were getting very difficult to get shots that were going to fetch them a lot of money. What they were doing a terrible job at was being human beings. When the former police commissioner of Philadelphia, I think there's a couple commissioners back, first got the job, he asked his officers one question: what do you think your job is? And most of them said to enforce the law. And he said, well, that seems like a very reasonable answer. But what if I were to tell you your job is to protect civil rights? Right now that encompasses enforcing the law, but it's a much bigger ask. It forces you to treat people with dignity and not just shoot them because they're Black. It's a harder job than they thought they had. And I can tell you this slide has been here since 2017, but I don't need to tell you that it has far more relevance now. But I am only further convinced that how you define your job can really be a matter of life and death for people. I would submit that our jobs are also harder than we think. Our jobs are not simply create really cool strategies, create an awesome taxonomy. We need to define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other. Now, there are people already working on this in different spheres. So Mike Montero at Mule Design has created a little red book of design ethics. It's a sort of first do no harm Hippocratic oath for designers. The Design Justice Network, which I highly recommend you check out, has a group of 10 principles, which sort of guide inclusive design. And I'm just going to read these first two because they're kind of amazing. Principle 1, we use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. Principle 2, we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. Now, just satisfying those first two principles alone, right, is a hell of a way to open a statement. And here, for our purposes, replace the word design with content strategy. And I think what this gets at is something that Erica Hall likes to call the difference between user-centered design, which is what we think we're practicing, and shareholder-centered design, which is often what we end up practicing. Another way to think about this is the Markula Center for Applied Ethics has released a wonderful guide for ethical decision-making, because the other thing to remember here is that we've had the practice of ethics for literally thousands of years. We have frameworks and tools to help us guide us through these difficult decisions that we have to make when we're creating our strategies and creating our designs. The thinking on this is not new. It's just the application is something we haven't really made time for or paid for yet. But you can see these basic, approaches that you can think about. Which option will produce the most good and do the least harm? Which option treats people equally, proportionally? These are the kinds of questions. Think of it as ethical quality assurance, right? You wouldn't release a website that hadn't been QA'd. You shouldn't release a design that hasn't been ethically QA'd. More fun interaction is the Tarot Cards of Tech, which I highly recommend you check out. And it's basically a set of cards that you click on and they flip around and you get these wonderful provoking questions like how might cultural habits change how your product is used, and how might your product change cultural habits? Just imagine if Twitter had asked itself this before MVP. Software engineers are getting in on this too. There was a few years back the Never Again pledge, where people who worked with big data pledged that they would not use that data or be involved in projects that were doing harm. And we're seeing some of this play out with places like Google, where they had Project Maven, which was a battlefield AI. And the software engineers got together and said, we did not get into this business to build weapons. We're essentially going to go on strike unless you can this project. And Google backed down. They walked away from a $250 million project with the government, and then turned right around and did Dragonfly, which is censored search in China, and they're still, hashing this one out. What I love about this, by the way, is these crazy James Bond style, like villain names for projects. Like some adult human actually wrote Project Maven in an email. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Now, this is not some tech guru at some TED Talk. This is Martin Luther King. 50 years ago, he saw this, and it's only more true today. So what I will challenge us with is, how might we define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other? Thank you.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Dave. That was amazing. I am going to invite anyone with questions to type their questions. Yep, standing ovation. Absolutely. Don't stand up at your desk, but yes, we're all in our hearts standing up and applauding. Thank you, Ralph, for that. For those of us who are doing content strategy in fields where people really want to sound smart, right? Like they're physicians or they're financial experts or they're lawyers, and trying to sell them on plain language and making things easy and clear is often a fight for the content strategist. How do you fight that battle? How do you tell them you
Sure.
sounding smart is not as important as making this plain and clear?
I mean, there's a couple arguments there, right? One is, if you want to appeal to their ego, um, being able to express something in plain language demonstrates a mastery of that topic. There's a great book by, I'll blank on his name, Randall Munroe, called Thing Explainer. And it takes heavy scientific concepts like how a rocket works, but it explains it using only the 1,000 most common words in the English language. And it's just a fascinating read. And so, like, he can't call it the Saturn rocket, he has to call it the thing go upper. But being able to express something, yeah, in the simplest terms means you really, really understand it. You're not relying on the jargon. So that's one thing to sort of point out. And another thing to point out is really try to align on goals.
Mm-hmm.
So, and again, I mean, depending on the audience, like if the audience is other scientists, great, jargon might be easier for them to understand. But if this is supposed to help ordinary person make an important decision, okay, you can show there's evidence that if our common, make it a common goal. It's like we're all on the same page here. We're trying to help these people, right? Let's make sure we agree on that first. Then if we can agree on that, we can say, oh, well, by the way, it turns out that plain language has been shown scientifically, and you can show them the scientific papers to improve that outcome, right? So this is a management consulting thing in general, but if you can align on goals, it makes it way easier to then make your argument, because now we're not arguing about whether or not to use plain language. We're just arguing about what is the best way to achieve this thing that we've all agreed is important.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Couple from the gallery. So first, have you come across any companies that are not responsive to doing this kind of work, and you don't need to disclose who, but if you have, what were their excuses or their rationale?
I would say very few companies are open to this. And that's not even just companies I've worked with, but just by watching the output of most companies, right? I think it is happening in smaller places we don't see so much. So I'll give you a couple examples. I know, for example, that LinkedIn, Stephanie Lucas at LinkedIn has been doing red team, blue team for a while now. I know that there's someone at Airbnb, they have an actual inclusive design like practice and officer there, which is not to say that Airbnb always acts ethically, right? So I think that what's more common right now isn't so much a hard yes or no from companies about this, but that you have kind of institutionalized bias that small pockets of teams are working on. I mean, that's kind of why I have a job. Like I'm rolling out an inclusive design workshop that I'm doing with different companies now. So I can't say that I've ever had an encounter where it's like, oh, we absolutely refuse to do this. I think it's much more, and this is true, it's funny, this is true with content strategy too. So it's not that I've had people be like, oh, content strategy is terrible. It's more apathy, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's more often I have to convince you that content, I often say like my job is to help people understand that you have to make decisions about content. Most people just don't want to even bother making decisions. It's not they're making bad decisions about content, they're making no decisions about content. And I feel like that's more often the case with companies and inclusive design. It's not that they're making bad decisions necessarily or intentional bad decisions about inclusive design. It's that they're making no decisions about inclusive design. And so the default is legacy, and the legacy's, well, pretty biased.
No, that's fair. And then tips to navigate through the ethical QA. So specifically, if the company doesn't see the ethical impact of our products, what might be next steps?
Sure. I mean, the idea is that honestly, if this stuff hasn't been discussed when you scope the project, whatever it is, it's not going to happen. That like what I encourage folks to do when they're trying to sort of develop an inclusive design practice is to start with small steps and just say, hey, so for example, there's an inclusive design best practice where at the beginning of a project, you look at your team and you're just very open and honest about, okay, what are our backgrounds here, right? I'm an African-American, my dad's from Ethiopia, whatever you're comfortable revealing, but however you identify, like put that all on the table. And just so we can say, okay, these are the perspectives that we are going into this project with. And then your next step is to say, whose perspectives are not represented here, right? Mm-hmm. That's like an hour meeting, maybe, depending on the size of the team. Mm-hmm. And I can go to someone and say, hey, I'd like just 1 hour on the books to do this, right? And you start there. And maybe you're able to show, okay, we had this much better outcome for X, Y, or Z. And you pick all those metrics before you start. But then maybe it's, oh, okay, that 1 hour worked out, great. Maybe now can we do just 1 day of red team? I just need 1 day, right? And you start to incrementally build this in. But it is going to go much easier if that's something you're agreeing on when you're scoping the project and estimating it and making sure it's in the budget, in the project plan. Like a lot of these decisions are really happening at the project management level and at the budgeting level. Because if they don't happen there, they're not really going to happen. I think we're all very familiar that if it's not in the budget, it isn't really going to happen. It doesn't really exist. So that's where I would suggest fighting that fight. And then on smaller teams, like if it's something you can kind of sneak in and be like, okay, I'm going to ask my buddy to come in and do a red team, just you know, just on the side.
We have another one out here from an ops person, which is really kind of interesting. So everything that you said really almost applies to like to life. And how do we think about communicating with our kids, our employees, you know, extending that reach? So communicate with, like, design for, you know, sort of all of those things.
I mean, I would say, I agree. This is, you know, I say Design for Cognitive Bias is the title of the book, but it's really just how to question your own assumptions in a systematic way, which is good for all of life. Honestly, the best advice I can give is to get really good at listening for a couple of reasons. One, and the best piece of advice I ever got in my life is from a guy named Alex Silman. And he said, it's impossible to listen and react at the same time. And it's true, right? You're having a conversation with somebody and they may say something and you might think in your head, oh, I've got a great comeback for that. Let me think about that comeback. And as soon as you start that process, you're no longer listening to what they have to say. You've missed like half of it. And they can tell. If on the other hand, you actively force yourself not to react, and this is something I practice every day. People will actually notice, like you can see people's body language change when they're actually being listened to. They start to relax a little bit because it's probably the first time it's happened all day. And B, it slows down your thinking because now you're paying attention. I mean, mindfulness in general is a really good way to fight bias. So just as a starting point, as something to have as a good habit, if you want to talk about just your daily life, that's probably the first, like, most impactful thing I think you can do. And then beyond that, if you want to talk about like talking to your kids, there's not a lot of great resources right now, but I have found it's good to start being conscious about patterns. So I'll tell you a story. I have an 11-year-old, and a few years back, he asked myself and my wife, and she's a pediatric neuropsychologist. And part of the reason I actually got interested in bias. He asked us like about famous female scientists, and between the two of us, and remember, she is a female scientist, we could still only come up with like 3 or 4. And we felt really bad about that. And we thought, okay, what can we do? So for a while, his bedtime reading became this basically big book of female scientists, where each page was a different female scientist. So each night we'd do another, story about a female scientist. And the idea was, rather than a pattern of male equals scientist and scientist equals male, now it was female equals scientist and scientist equals female, right? Trying to set up that pattern so that, later in life, he's still going to get bombarded with the opposite pattern, but now he's got a fighting chance, right? Yeah. To have a different default. So honestly, that's how we've been thinking about that a lot. And I had him on my podcast once. He's getting really good at just identifying these things on his own now.
Julia's intrigued by the rhyming rule. Can see this working with marketing headlines, but can you think of ways to incorporate this in product content strategy?
Interesting. So you're talking about, because we always have to define product content strategy. So you're talking about sort of like UX writing, interaction design, like writing, like that sort of thing?
Julia, feel free to unmute. And she said thumbs up. That's what she meant.
Okay, yeah. I don't see why it wouldn't work. I would imagine that the thing you're really going for with most of these things is terseness. That if someone's trying to accomplish a task, the less verbiage, the better. If it's a situation where you really need to build trust, that's where I think the rhyming, becomes a little more valuable. But clarity, in product content strategy, clarity is kind of king, right? Because if I'm trying to accomplish a task, the last thing I need is, again, anything difficult to process. So plain language, definitely. But if you need that extra layer of believability, maybe writing, or if it needs to be memorable, because remember, rhymes are memorable. So if it's something that a task that someone has to be able to do, maybe without having to consult what you've written the second time or the third time, that's another place rhyming might be helpful.
Thank you.
Awesome. And then my last question is for those folks who are looking for opportunities, you know, who knows how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted people career-wise, and you send in your resume and you have a girl name, or you have a name that clearly indicates you're a person of color, or you have a name that clearly indicates something that might put you on the less advantageous side of a bias. How do you overcome that? I mean, should we start sending in redacted proposals and resumes, or like what are your recommendations for overcoming that?
All right, so my answer here is going to be very morally ambiguous.
Okay.
I'm going to give you several answers to choose from because I don't know your life, and I'm not going to presume what situation you're in and how desperately you need a job. But so a few things to consider. First thing to consider, and it's the most depressing part, yes, in fact, it has been shown, at least for Asians and Black people, if you whiten your resume to remove any distinguishing characteristics that would point you out as Asian or Black, if you're Asian, you have twice as much chance of being called back. And if you're Black, you have 2.5 times as much chance of being called back, even at companies that claim to embrace inclusivity. So the sad truth is, if I'm being purely practical, you will increase your odds of getting a job by whitening your resume. That's the statistical truth. The soul truth is more along the lines of, do you want to work at a place that does not respect or value your diversity? That would, in some unconscious way, prefer if you were white. And again, I am not asking that as I already know the answer to that question. I am asking that as a consider it, because if you are down to your last dime, you got to make rent. Maybe you do want to work at a place that isn't really valuing, your identity, because you got to make rent. I'm not going to judge that, but understand, have some sense of those dynamics. Make a thoughtful process decision around that. But ideally, we're going to get to a world, like I talk about anonymized resumes. That's a Band-Aid, right? But ideally, we get to a world where, no, it's great. I want to know everything about you before I hire you because I value everything about you. We're not in that world right now. So those are the decisions we have to make. So I wish I had a sort of more upbeat answer for you on that one, but there's the hard facts statistical answer. And then there's the, for your soul, think about these things answer as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's sad. That's hurt. Who is this? Tracy says she's hurt. I agree, Tracy. That is hurtful. I think, the other thing is, if you have a local groups like this is networking and relationship building. Hopefully you can bypass the whole application process altogether.
Yeah, and I was just on the phone with a project manager who wants to work at a place that values inclusive design. And I said, look, there are the people who know, so I talked about Stephanie Lucas at LinkedIn, right? She knows people. These people know, the people who care about inclusive design know each other, right? And they hire each other. And that's good job advice, regardless of whether we're talking about anonymized resumes. Because at the end of the day, most of the best jobs you're not getting because of your resume. Most of the best jobs you're getting because somebody knows somebody. So in that world, which is very much the world we live in, you want to get to know people who are into inclusive design. And I'll post this with the resource sheet I send out, but there are a number of Slack groups that are very focused on inclusive design, and all of them have job boards, just saying.
That's right. Dave, if you have time for one more question.
Sure.
Real quick. Okay. From Catherine, we've been doing a bunch of user research in our big website projects and rollouts. We use a third party to find and administer the research to participants, most of whom are random but fit our target audience. Can we specify that X% of the participants are people of color? Seems like an opportunity, but not sure how to go about doing this since it's more or less random. I think she wants to ensure that there's a diverse pool, but if it's random selection, how do you do that?
Yeah, and I don't want to step too far out of my lane because you're starting to get into things like statistical significance, and I am not a UX researcher. I know some awesome UX researchers, but I would say back to basics, if you can argue that in order for our research to be more valid for what it is we're trying to do, we need a certain percent of that randomized pool to be pulled from this population or that population. I think you're safe as long as you're aligning with your goals. I mean, again, I am hugely in favor of bringing out outside perspectives, especially perspectives I don't know what you're designing, but if you're designing something that is going to impact a particular population, I would make sure you're getting feedback. I would overestimate or overcount for the most vulnerable parts of that population. So real quick story, City of Philadelphia does a participatory design project with the Office of Homeless Services. And the first thing to do is figure out who's going to be most impacted by this policy and who has the least power. And that would be the people delivering services to people experiencing homelessness and the people experiencing homelessness, right? So their entire design process was built around making sure that they're getting feedback from those people and giving them more power in the design process, right? So that they have more decision-making power in the things that impact them. So I would actually think about that variable when you're looking at that randomized population. Is anyone in this population more vulnerable than anyone else in that population? That might be a good way to think about it.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you so much. This just changed my life.
Oh, fine.
Thank you so much.
We truly appreciate it. And this was, y'all, this was a long time coming. We had originally hoped to host this last fall and
I remember
ran into a number of roadblocks. So Dave, thanks for hanging with us and,
Sure.
and doing this now. We really appreciate it.